In 1943, while B-17 bombers plummeted in flames over Europe and fighter pilots fought for their lives at 25,000 feet of altitude, a seemingly insignificant discovery was being made at an air base in Texas. A veteran pilot, observing inconsistent shooting patterns during survival training, noticed something that would challenge decades of military doctrine on firearms. The M1911 pistol, considered effective only in close combat, could become lethal at distances military manuals deemed impossible. The hot metal of the weapon contrasted with the cold Texas morning air, while 45 ACP cartridges ricocheted off the dirt ground, far beyond the intended target. This seemingly trivial observation would reveal a hidden truth about ballistics that would transform the understanding of personal firearms in combat, exposing how perceived limitations were, in reality, matters of misunderstood technique. Official history had always proclaimed the M1911 as a short-range weapon, but the reality on the firing range suggested something completely different. Captain James Tex Morrison had survived 17 missions over enemy territory when he was assigned to instruct new pilots at Randolph Air Force Base. A veteran of aerial combat over Germany, Morrison possessed something many instructors lacked: real experience in situations where every shot could mean the difference between life and death. During survival training sessions, downed pilots needed to master not only navigation and evasion, but also the effective use of the M1911, their only protection should they encounter enemy patrols. Military doctrine stipulated that the pistol was effective up to 25 yards, a distance at which the sights were factory calibrated. Beyond that, the weapon was considered inadequate for precise engagements. Morrison, however, had observed something intriguing during his own survival training. Experienced shooters achieved consistent hits at 50 yards, but only when instinctively adjusting their aim. The mystery lay in understanding exactly how these adjustments worked and why they were not officially taught. The M1911, developed by John Moses Browning and adopted by the American Army in 1911, represented the pinnacle of firearms engineering of its time. Its 45 ACP cartridge, with a 230-grain projectile traveling at approximately 830 feet per second, possessed exceptional stopping power in close combat. The sights consisted of a fixed rear sight and a front sight post, calibrated to converge the point of impact with the point of aim at 25 yards. This configuration worked perfectly for urban and trench combat, where most engagements occurred at distances under 30 yards. However, the ballistic trajectory of the 45 ACP projectile followed a predictable parabola. After leaving the barrel, the projectile rose slightly due to the sight angle, reached its peak near 25 yards, and then began to drop due to gravity. At 50 yards, this drop became significant, approximately 4 inches below the original point of aim. To compensate for this drop, it would be necessary to adjust the point of aim upwards, creating what Morrison began to call the odd offset. Morrison began his experiments methodically, documenting each shooting session in a worn leather notebook he had carried since his flight training days. Using standard Army targets at 50 yards, he began by testing the M1911's accuracy with factory sights. The results confirmed official doctrine. At 50 yards, projectiles consistently impacted 4 to 5 inches below the center of the target. Horizontal dispersion remained acceptable, but the vertical drop made precise shots virtually impossible. Morrison then began experimenting with different points of aim, instructing shooters to aim progressively higher than the desired target. After weeks of tests, he discovered that by aiming approximately 6 inches above the center of the target at 50 yards, projectiles consistently impacted within the lethal zone. This odd offset perfectly compensated for the ballistic drop, but it created a dilemma. The pistol's sights had no markings for this adjustment, forcing shooters to develop improvised visual references. The technique worked, but it seemed to contradict decades of standardized military training. Resistance to Morrison's discovery came from unexpected sources. Senior officers argued that training pilots for precise shots at 50 yards was unnecessary and potentially dangerous, as it could encourage them to engage enemies at distances where they should be evading. Small arms instructors insisted that the M1911 was not designed for long-range precision shooting, and that modifying established aiming techniques could confuse soldiers in combat. Technical Manual TM-91152-1112, which governed the use of the M1911, clearly specified that the weapon was effective up to 50 yards, accurate up to 25 yards. Changing this doctrine would require approval from higher echelons and revision of training manuals throughout the force. Morrison faced a classic dilemma. His discovery worked on the firing range, but it challenged institutional wisdom. He needed irrefutable evidence to convince skeptics who viewed his technique as an interesting, but militarily irrelevant, curiosity. Pressure mounted as new pilots arrived for training, many destined for the Pacific Theater, where survival situations were increasingly common. The decisive moment arrived during an unofficial demonstration for Colonel William Bull Henderson, base commander and a World War I veteran. Henderson, known for his practical approach and skepticism towards unnecessary innovations, agreed to observe Morrison's experiments merely to settle the matter once and for all. On an October morning in 1943, with calm wind and perfect visibility, Morrison organized a comparative demonstration. First, 5 experienced shooters fired at targets at 50 yards using standard aiming techniques. The results were predictable, consistent groupings 4 inches below the center, confirming official doctrine. Next, the same shooters repeated the exercise using Morrison's odd offset, aiming 6 inches above the center of the target. The results were dramatic. 4 of the 5 shooters achieved groupings within the target's lethal zone with accuracy comparable to that obtained at 25 yards with conventional sights. Henderson observed in silence, making notes in a standard military pad, his expression revealing growing surprise. The scientific explanation behind the success of the odd offset lay in fundamental ballistic principles that, paradoxically, were well understood by artillery, but neglected in small arms training. When a projectile leaves a weapon's barrel, it follows a parabolic trajectory influenced by gravity, air resistance, and initial velocity. The M1911, with its sights calibrated for 25 yards, created a trajectory where the projectile crossed the line of sight 2 times, once near the barrel, approximately 7 yards, and again at 25 yards. Beyond this distance, the projectile continued its downward trajectory. Morrison had discovered that by adjusting the point of aim to compensate for this drop, it was possible to create a third intersection point at 50 yards. The mathematics was elegant. The additional angle of elevation, approximately 2.3 degrees, precisely compensated for the additional gravitational drop. This technique did not physically modify the weapon, but rather the aiming methodology, utilizing the inherent ballistic capability of the .45 ACP cartridge that had always existed but had never been systematically explored. Henderson authorized expanded tests involving instructors from different bases and a wider variety of shooters. The results consistently confirmed Morrison's findings. Shooters trained in the odd offset technique achieved lethal precision at 50 yards in 78% of cases, compared to only 23% using conventional techniques. More importantly, the technique did not compromise accuracy at shorter distances. Shooters could switch between conventional sights for close targets and the offset for distant targets without significant confusion. The War Department began to show interest, especially considering reports from the Pacific, where downed pilots faced combat situations at varied distances. However, implementing changes in military training during wartime presented enormous logistical challenges. Thousands of instructors would need to be retrained, manuals rewritten, and new qualification protocols developed. Institutional resistance remained strong, with arguments that limited resources should focus on more critical priorities than marginal improvements in secondary weapons. The first practical application of Morrison's technique occurred unofficially, through pilots who had trained with him and were subsequently deployed to the Pacific Theater. Field reports began arriving in late 1943, describing successful engagements at distances that surprised both the pilots themselves and their rescue units. Lieutenant Robert Bobby Chen, a P-51 pilot shot down over the Philippines, reported neutralizing 2 Japanese soldiers at approximately 45 yards, using Morrison's technique, allowing his successful evasion. Captain Michael Irish O'Sullivan, a survivor of a forced landing on Iwo Jima, credited Morrison's training for his ability to effectively engage enemy patrols while heading to a rescue zone. These reports, initially treated as interesting anecdotes, began to form a pattern that caught the attention of intelligence officers. The technique not only worked in controlled training conditions, but also under the extreme stress of real combat, where extended-range precision could mean the difference between capture and freedom. The most intriguing aspect of Morrison's discovery was its fundamental simplicity. For decades, the Army had accepted M1911 limitations that were, in reality, limitations of technique, not of the weapon's capability. The pistol had always possessed the ballistic potential for precise shots at 50 yards. It merely lacked the knowledge to effectively utilize it. This revelation raised uncomfortable questions about other limitations, accepted without question. How many other military capabilities were being underutilized due to unquestioned doctrines? Morrison had demonstrated that innovation did not always require new technology or additional resources. Sometimes, it was enough to re-examine fundamental assumptions. His methodical approach, documenting each test and refining the technique through systematic experimentation, contrasted with the military tendency to accept technical specifications as absolute limits. The odd offset represented more than an improved shooting technique. It symbolized the power of critical observation and practical experimentation to overcome perceived limitations. Official validation of Morrison's technique came through an unexpected path: the Small Arms Development Project at Aberdeen Proving Ground. In January 1944, military engineers conducted comprehensive ballistic tests of the M1911, including trajectory analysis at extended distances. Their findings mathematically confirmed what Morrison had empirically discovered. The 45 ACP cartridge maintained sufficient energy and acceptable accuracy, up to 75 yards, well beyond the 25 yards traditionally considered the effective limit. Tests revealed that at 50 yards, the projectile still retained 89% of its initial energy and accuracy within 3 inches under ideal conditions. Morrison's technique was formally tested by expert shooters, resulting in approval for inclusion in advanced training manuals. Technical Bulletin TB 91052111, published in March 1944, formalized the technique as the alternative aiming method for extended engagements, though it informally continued to be known as Morrison's offset among instructors and pilots. This validation represented a rare victory for grassroots innovation over military bureaucracy, demonstrating that practical observation could successfully challenge decades of established doctrine. The implementation of Morrison's technique faced significant practical challenges that revealed unexpected complexities of wartime military training. Experienced instructors, many with decades of experience teaching conventional techniques, needed to be retrained in methods that contradicted their established knowledge. Some openly resisted, arguing that confusing soldiers with multiple aiming techniques could be counterproductive in high-tension combat situations. Others embraced the innovation, recognizing its potential to save lives in survival situations. Training was initially limited to pilots and special operations personnel, groups considered sophisticated enough to master advanced techniques without confusion. Training ammunition, already scarce due to combat demands, needed to be allocated for extended practice sessions required to master the offset. Firing ranges needed to be modified to accommodate targets at 50 yards, a non-standard distance in most facilities. Despite these obstacles, the program gradually expanded, driven by positive field reports and pressure from commanders who recognized the practical value of the technique. Morrison meticulously documented the variables affecting the effectiveness of his technique, creating the first comprehensive manual for pistol precision shooting at extended distances. Weather conditions proved critical. Crosswinds of 10 miles per hour could deflect projectiles up to 3 inches at 50 yards, requiring additional compensation. Temperature affected projectile velocity. Cartridges fired in cold weather, below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, showed slightly lower trajectories, while extreme heat, above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, produced higher trajectories. Different ammunition batches showed velocity variations that could affect accuracy, forcing shooters to adjust techniques for specific ammunition. Morrison developed a system of visual references for different conditions. In ideal weather, aim at the top edge of the target. With strong headwind, aim 2 inches higher. With cold ammunition, add 1 extra inch of elevation. These nuances transformed what initially seemed a simple technique into a complex system that required extensive training and constant practice. Accuracy depended not only on shooting mechanics, but on a deep understanding of applied ballistics. The transformation in the mindset of pilots in training was profound and unexpected. Many had accepted the M1911 as a last resort weapon, useful only if enemies came dangerously close. The discovery that they could effectively engage targets at 50 yards transformed their perception of the pistol from a passive defensive tool to a capable offensive weapon. This shift in perspective affected survival tactics. Instead of avoiding contact at all costs, pilots began to consider active engagement when advantageous. Reports from military psychologists indicated a significant increase in pilot confidence during survival training, with many expressing that they felt less helpless in enemy territory. However, this increased confidence also created concerns. Some pilots might become overly aggressive, seeking confrontation when evasion would be more prudent. Instructors needed to emphasize that the technique expanded options, but did not eliminate the need for careful tactical judgment. The balance between confidence and caution became a critical element of training. Morrison's technique revealed significant disparities between different M1911 models and manufacturers, exposing quality variations that had gone unnoticed in conventional tests. Pistols manufactured by Colt showed superior consistency at 50 yards, with average groupings of 2.8 inches. Models produced by Remington Rand showed slightly inferior accuracy, with groupings of 3.4 inches, but still within acceptable standards. Pistols from Union Switch and Signal, manufactured under pressure of wartime production, showed significant variability. Some rivaled Colt models, while others barely achieved 5-inch groupings. These discoveries forced a revision of quality control standards and led to the implementation of 50-yard accuracy tests for all pistols intended for pilots and special operations personnel. Morrison developed a 20-shot test protocol that identified pistols unsuitable for use with his technique, resulting in a selection program that ensured only superior accuracy weapons were distributed to personnel who relied on extended shooting capability. This secondary discovery proved almost as valuable as the original technique. The development of specialized ammunition to maximize the effectiveness of Morrison's technique began as an unofficial project in military arsenals. Ballistic engineers experimented with different projectile weights, powder charges, and bullet shapes to optimize precision at 50 yards. 200-grain projectiles, lighter than the standard 230 grains, showed a flatter trajectory, reducing the offset necessary to 4 inches instead of 6. However, these lighter projectiles sacrificed stopping power at close distances, creating a tactical dilemma. Boat-tail projectiles demonstrated superior accuracy due to better aerodynamic stability, but they were significantly more expensive to produce. Increased powder charges improved trajectory, but accelerated weapon wear and increased recoil, making rapid follow-up shots difficult. After extensive tests, a Mark II Mod 1 load was developed specifically for use with Morrison's technique, a 215-grain projectile with a slightly increased charge, offering an ideal compromise between extended accuracy and stopping power. This specialized ammunition was produced in limited quantities for selected units. Institutional resistance to Morrison's technique peaked during a review of training policies in May 1944. Conservative generals argued that limited resources should focus on essential training, not on specialized refinements of questionable value. General Harrison "Hammer" Smith, a World War I veteran and staunch defender of traditional methods, publicly declared that American soldiers win wars with courage and determination, not with fancy shooting tricks. This high-level opposition threatened to cancel the entire program, forcing Morrison and his supporters to gather irrefutable evidence of the technique's practical value. A crucial demonstration was organized at the Pentagon, where Morrison personally demonstrated the technique to an audience of skeptical senior officers. Using a standard M1911 and common ammunition, he achieved 18 hits out of 20 shots in the center of targets at 50 yards, a performance that silenced critics and ensured the program's continuation. The demonstration was followed by a presentation of field data showing a 23% higher survival rate among pilots trained in the technique, a final argument that secured official approval. Morrison began receiving reports of creative applications of his technique in combat situations he had never anticipated. Sergeant Tommy Tex Rodriguez, a survival instructor who had learned the technique, adapted it for infantry training in urban combat, where engagements at 40 to 50 yards were common in European cities. Helicopter pilots in the Pacific discovered they could use the technique to engage ground targets during rescue missions, transforming the M1911 into an improvised aerial support weapon. More surprisingly, intelligence officers reported that the technique was being used by agents infiltrated into occupied territory, where the ability to neutralize sentinels at safe distances was crucial for clandestine operations. Each new application revealed aspects of the technique that Morrison had not considered, demonstrating how practical innovation often finds uses beyond its original intent. The versatility of the technique began to attract attention from other service branches, with the Navy and Marine Corps requesting training for their own specialized units. Comprehensive statistical analysis of the effectiveness of Morrison's technique, compiled by the War Department in August 1944, revealed surprising data that definitively validated its military importance. Among 2,847 pilots trained in the technique, the survival rate in evasion situations increased from 67% to 84%, a statistically significant difference representing hundreds of lives saved. More impressively, the average evasion time decreased from 4.2 days to 2.8 days, indicating that pilots with extended engagement capability could navigate hostile territory more quickly and with greater confidence. Analysis of ammunition consumed showed that pilots trained in the technique used an average of 3.4 fewer cartridges per engagement, suggesting that increased accuracy reduced the need for multiple shots. Medical reports indicated a 31% reduction in injuries among rescued pilots, attributed to the ability to neutralize threats before they reached dangerous distances. These data transformed Morrison's technique from an interesting curiosity into a proven effective military tool, justifying program expansion and allocation of additional resources for training and development. The long-term effects of Morrison's discovery extended far beyond the context of World War II, influencing the development of precision shooting techniques that became fundamental in modern military operations. Special forces from multiple nations adopted variations of his methodology, adapting the principles of ballistic compensation for different weapons and cartridges. Morrison's scientific approach, combining empirical observation with rigorous mathematical analysis, established a precedent for evidence-based armaments development that would continue to influence military research for decades. Civilian shooting schools began to incorporate elements of his technique into advanced courses, recognizing that the principles applied beyond the military context. More importantly, Morrison had demonstrated that perceived limitations frequently reflect incomplete knowledge, not inherent capabilities of the technology. This lesson inspired generations of engineers and scientists to question fundamental assumptions in their own fields, leading to advances in seemingly unrelated areas. Morrison's meticulous documentation of performance variations across different environmental conditions laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the modern science of external ballistics applied to small arms. His detailed records on the effects of temperature, humidity, altitude, and barometric pressure on projectile trajectory were later used by researchers at Aberdeen Proving Ground to develop more precise ballistic tables. The odd offset technique evolved into adjustable sight systems that allowed for rapid compensation for different distances, eliminating the need for complex mental calculations during combat. Weapon manufacturers began to incorporate distance markings into their sights, recognizing that trained shooters could effectively utilize ballistic capabilities that were previously wasted. Morrison's influence extended to the development of specialized ammunition, with manufacturers creating cartridges optimized for precision at extended distances. His holistic approach, considering weapon, ammunition, technique, and environmental conditions as an integrated system, became standard in the armaments industry. Official recognition of Morrison's contribution came gradually and initially discreetly. During the war, operational security considerations limited the dissemination of his technique, classified as sensitive information that could benefit enemy forces if captured. Only after the conflict, when details of military innovations began to be declassified, did the magnitude of his discovery become apparent to the wider scientific community. Morrison received the Civilian Medal of Merit in 1947, an honor rarely awarded to military personnel for technical contributions. More significant was his appointment to the newly created Small Arms Development Council, a position that allowed him to influence military research and development for years after the war. Universities began inviting Morrison to lecture on scientific methodology applied to practical problems, recognizing that his approach transcended military applications. His story became a case study in engineering schools, illustrating how careful observation and systematic experimentation could overcome seemingly fundamental limitations. Morrison's technique revealed a fundamental truth about innovation that resonated far beyond the military context. The greatest discoveries often emerge not from revolutionary technology, but from a deeper understanding of existing capabilities. His methodical approach, observation, hypothesis, experimentation, validation, demonstrated that the scientific method could be applied effectively to urgent practical problems, even under the pressure of wartime. The initial resistance he faced illustrated how established institutions frequently resist changes that challenge accepted doctrines, regardless of empirical evidence. However, Morrison's persistence and the strength of his data eventually overcame institutional skepticism, establishing a precedent for evidence-based innovation that would influence military development for generations. His discovery remained a testament that sometimes the most powerful solutions do not require complex inventions, but simply the courage to question why things are as they are, and the discipline to seek answers through rigorous experimentation. The transformation of the M1911 from a close combat weapon to an extended precision tool through Morrison's technique represented more than a tactical advance. It symbolized the triumph of scientific curiosity over institutional complacency. In a world where limitations were frequently accepted without question, a veteran pilot proved that the true frontier was not in technology, but in understanding. His discovery saved lives, changed doctrines, and established a precedent for innovation that would continue to influence military development far beyond World War II. Morrison's odd offset remains proof that careful observation, combined with systematic experimentation and persistence in the face of resistance, can reveal hidden capabilities in familiar tools, transforming perceived limitations into unexpected advantages.